Joe Biden, on the day we're recording this, it's been a year since his inauguration. Biden obviously swept to power following Trump. His the big promise of his presidency was that he was going to restore normalcy, partly putting an end to the divisiveness of the Trump years, but also putting an end to the pandemic. Tom, how would you rate him on that particular promise?
It's not going particularly well, is it? And it's interesting because I think it's worth casting our minds back to just how in dreamland the American commentariat were around the time of that inauguration. I mean, the quotes that were coming out, one of like PBS's national correspondents, I think, said something to the effect, it's like the superheroes have come to save us. People on CNN talking about the lights down the side of the National Mall being like Joe Biden's arms reaching out into America. It became kind of sub-North Korea for a while. And of course, he's been completely incapable of delivering because he's not only quite a doddery figure, but he's obviously quite poorly advised. This idea that he was going to solve the pandemic overnight was so ridiculous. I mean, he's presiding over, I think he's about to eclipse Trump's death toll with vaccines, which is a pretty, impressive feat. And on this question of kind of the culture wars, because one argument that I'm sure we all noticed, even amongst kind of anti-woke liberals, if you like, was that if you hate the culture war, vote for Joe Biden. The thing about Trump is he's just like kerosene on the fire. He makes it all worse. And they're right to an extent, not least because of the way in which he would kind of inflame this level of opposition. But if anything, he's sort of institutionalized the culture. I mean, one of the first things he did when he got into office was to produce that executive order, essentially directing the federal bureaucracy to the ends of tackling systemic racism. So that very contested sort of identity politics term is right at the heart of government. Basically racial preferences being suggested for COVID relief, and also just at any juncture feeling the need to go along with the culture war fad rather than to challenge it. The Rittenhouse trial was a good example of that, him essentially calling into question the jury result rather than accepting, as anyone would, that it was a quite fair conclusion for them to come to. So in just all of these different situations, the idea that he was going to be this unifying figure it's been proved to be completely bollocks. Not because I think he's, sat around reading, identitarian websites all day and is, desperate to share his pronouns with people. But for whatever reason, the Democratic Party recognises that that's kind of its base now, is that kind of academic media blob who are really enthralled to these ideas, have become more enthralled to them over the course of the Trump years, and that there's almost a political cost to be paid from them from deviating from it. So I think it's that idea that he was going to return normalcy, particularly on the question of the culture war, has just been completely exploded by this point, I think.
And particularly on race. I mean, it's striking how inflammatory Biden has been a lot of the time. He talks about, various Republican efforts to change voting systems. I mean, we don't want to get into the details of that. It's a very sort of wonkish question. He talks of that as like a kind of 21st century Jim Crow. Yeah. When he was commemorating the horrific kind of Tulsa massacre 100 years on, he said the racism that was alive in 1921 is still here today.
Yeah.
Well,
he's done that thing, hasn't he, that all culture warriors do, which is to make the claim that there has been no real change in society, because what's happened is that all the racism that was in society has just been subsumed, so it's just harder to detect, but it's still there. Like Robin DiAngelo says that in a sense, the modern day situation is worse than Jim Crow. She would go that far, and he's bought on into all of that. I don't know if it's him or his advisors or the people around him. I don't know, but they've very much seized are behaving like culture warriors. I mean, even that on the January the 6th, the anniversary of the Capitol riots, and they were comparing it to 9/11 and all sorts of things. Pearl Harbor, exactly. Yeah. And that's so preposterous. It's and everyone can see that's preposterous. And one of the key features of the identitarian left is that they do run with narratives that are observably false. Yeah. And they just repeat them often enough in the hope that people will just go along with those narratives. Everyone knows it's not true, but you just sort of have to pay lip service to it. And they're definitely doing that. I find with him as well, I mean, he's obviously had a disastrous year. The way to measure it is his poll ratings, approval ratings. And whereas Trump, was always divisive, he was, when he came in, he was an unpopular president. Yeah. And his approval ratings, it got worse a bit, but not much. It just it was fairly stable. And Biden's have plummeted, right? Yeah. So he came in as a really popular figure, and the reason I suppose that they plummeted is we've seen him now. His election strategy was to hide, and
stay in his basement,
basement, and of course the press didn't give him any hard questions at all. They gave him a really easy time. It was only Afghanistan. That's when the approval ratings started to plummet, because for once he was up there having to answer difficult questions, and we can see how hopeless He is. And so, yeah, I mean, it's probably too early, but isn't it over for him? I mean, he's so... He can't run. He's not going to run again.
No,
clearly, but
and it's interesting as well because not only has he been found out, but kind of Kamala Harris has been found out.
She was found out before because
of course.
She had to drop out of the primary so early because she's so hopeless,
and she couldn't get black votes in particular, which is funny because she's such a really lent into that kind of I am the representative of the minority vote and all the rest of it. Whereas this old white guy did very well. But it was it's they've both been sort of found out. I mean, Kamala Harris has had a run of really embarrassing kind of interviews or public statements where it's incapable of almost saying anything, because she doesn't really believe anything, I think, a lot of the time. I mean, I think they were asking her about, isn't it time that you got a grip on this aspect of the COVID crisis? And she went into this very strange aspect. It is always the time, every day, for us to be... So it's like a malfunctioning motivational speaker or something. Yeah. Like, it's really, really quite strange. But I think there's something important in there. And as you say, Biden is very doddery, where it's strange because all of this kind of really divisive politics has kind of found its way to the centre of this administration, but not because of some impassioned belief in it necessarily. In their own ways, they're quite insubstantial figures. I mean, people often talk about wokeness as if it's like a new religion. In some sense, I feel like it's just become like the sort of official religion in America quite explicitly. You don't necessarily have to go to church every Sunday, but you just get that that's what you have to defer to. You get that you have to tip your hat to the narrative. You get that you have to keep the clerisy happy, if you like, not to stretch the metaphor too far. And what's interesting about that is I'd be interesting to see how this pans out for him electorally, because of the fact we've already had the Virginia gubernatorial race, which was again sort of very polarised about kind of woke issues in education and critical race theory and all the rest of it. Also, the fact that Trump doing better amongst ethnic minorities last time around. And I think one thing that could very easily happen, and various Democratic kind of pollsters have pointed this out and made themselves quite unpopular for doing so, is that it will become increasingly clear that this fealty to wokeness is something which, will win you the support of the faculty lounge, but certainly won't win you the support of working class people, but also the multiracial ethnic, the multi-ethnic working class are going to have problems with it. We're already starting to see that in certain groups. And I think that's something which is going to potentially become more and more clear, particularly as there's more kind of electoral tests, if you like.
But isn't it weird? Because we've known that for a long time. Everyone's known that. Hillary Clinton lost on the basis, I think, largely on the basis of the fact that she was dividing the electorate up and into identity groups. This is something that we know that the left, I think the right can often win through identity politics if they play that sort of nationalist card. I don't think the left can. They always lose when it comes to this. So why can't they learn this lesson? I find this bizarre. I don't know the answer to that. I just think it's odd.